On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1982, roughly 230 miles east of Cape Horn, Commander Chris Wreford-Brown gave the order to load torpedo tubes 1, 2 and 6 aboard HMS Conqueror. His weapons officer didn't reach for the Mark XXIV Tigerfish, the Royal Navy's modern, wire-guided homing torpedo, developed across 2 decades and purpose-built for exactly this kind of engagement. Conqueror carried Tigerfish in her remaining 3 tubes as a contingency. But Wreford-Brown didn't trust them. In testing, only 40% of the early Mod 0 variant had performed as designed. The torpedo had a tendency to dip on launch, snapping its own guidance wire before it could track a thing. What went into tubes 1, 2 and 6 instead were Mark VIII torpedoes. Unguided, straight-running, contact-fused weapons, first introduced in 1927. 55 years old. Each packed an 805-pound Torpex warhead. The most advanced nuclear attack submarine in the South Atlantic was about to fire ordnance older than some of the men loading it. A 608-foot Argentine cruiser sat on the surface ahead of them. ARA General Belgrano, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser displacing over 12,000 tons at full load, flanked by 2 Exocet-armed destroyers, Hipólito Bouchard and Piedra Buena. 1,100 men were aboard the cruiser alone. Wreford-Brown had been tracking this group for more than 2 days. His most capable torpedo was one he couldn't rely on, and he'd spent the last hours closing the gap before the shot. He fired anyway. Exactly 1 month earlier, on April 2nd, Argentine forces had invaded the Falkland Islands, overwhelming the small Royal Marine garrison at Stanley in a matter of hours. South Georgia fell the next day. Within 48 hours, the British War Cabinet ordered a naval task force assembled to retake the islands, 8,000 miles from home in the approaching South Atlantic winter. The surface fleet would take weeks to arrive. Submarines were faster. HMS Conqueror, a Churchill-class nuclear-powered fleet submarine, pennant number S48, sailed from Faslane on the Gairloch in Scotland on April 4th, 2 days after the invasion. She was the 3rd and last boat of her class, built by Camel Laird at Birkenhead and commissioned on November 9th, 1971. Her construction had been troubled from the start. Workforce slowdowns and deliberate sabotage of the ship's gearbox at the Camel Laird yard delayed completion by several months. By 1982, she'd been in service for a decade, running Cold War patrols against the Soviet Northern Fleet. Her hull measured 86.9 meters in length, displaced 4,900 tons submerged, and was powered by a single Rolls-Royce pressurized water reactor, driving 1 shaft to 28 knots underwater. Crew complement: 103 officers and ratings. 6 bow torpedo tubes could fire Mark VIII's, Tigerfish homing torpedoes, or sub-Harpoon anti-ship missiles. In addition to her standard complement, she carried a small team from the Special Boat Service, 6 operators with roughly 6 tons of equipment crammed into an already packed torpedo room. Her commanding officer was Wreford-Brown, then 37 years old, a career submariner whose entire professional life had been preparation for Cold War operations against Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic. When the Argentine crisis began, Wreford-Brown had new orders: proceed south at maximum sustainable speed. Conqueror reached the South Atlantic Theatre by April 11th and began patrolling near South Georgia. Over the following 2 weeks, she landed SBS operators on the island's north coast on April 19th in preparation for its recapture under Operation Paraquet, searched for the Argentine submarine Santa Fe, reported heading toward the island, and monitored the area as British forces retook South Georgia on April 25th. On April 28th, new orders arrived. Sail west. Search for Argentine surface ships reportedly gathering north of Isla de los Estados. The transit was hard. The Southern Ocean in late autumn threw heavy seas at the submarine for days. These weren't catastrophic conditions, but they meant the boat that arrived south of the Falklands at the end of April had already spent 3 weeks running in some of the roughest seas on Earth. She could fight. By the night of April 30th, Conqueror's sonar operators picked up the sound of propellers at long range, 100 nautical miles, detected on the long-range sonar array. They'd found what they were looking for. Argentina hadn't left its navy idle. Task Force 79, under Vice Admiral Juan Lombardo, had deployed 3 surface groups around the Falklands, with orders to defend the islands and, if opportunity presented itself, strike the approaching British carrier battle group. The most dangerous element sat to the north. Task Group 79.1, built around the aircraft carrier ARA 25 de Mayo, carrying 8 A-4 Skyhawk attack aircraft and 6 S-2E tracker reconnaissance planes, escorted by 2 Type 42 destroyers, sister ships to the vessels forming the core of Britain's own air defence screen. A second northern group, Task Group 79.4, comprised 3 Exocet-armed Drummond-class corvettes. The southern arm was Task Group 79.3. General Belgrano and her 2 destroyer escorts, each carrying 4 Exocet anti-ship missiles. Belgrano herself was a veteran of a different war entirely. Commissioned in 1938 as USS Phoenix, she had been moored at Pearl Harbor during the Japanese attack on December 7, 1941, and escaped undamaged, one of the few ships to steam out of the harbor under her own power that morning. She earned 9 battle stars for service across the Pacific theater, including the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, before being decommissioned and sold to Argentina in 1951. Renamed after the country's independence-era general, Manuel Belgrano, she carried 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets, a 5.5-inch armour belt, and a complement that in wartime swelled to over 1,000 men. She'd been refitted with British Seacat anti-aircraft missiles in the late 1960s, but her offensive punch remained those guns. 13-mile range, outclassing anything mounted on the British escorts. Her anti-submarine capability, however, was negligible. According to Narendra Sethia, a junior officer aboard Conqueror, who later met surviving Argentine officers in Buenos Aires, the cruiser's carpenters had reportedly fabricated wooden Exocet launchers and mounted them on deck to make the ship appear more threatening than it was. Her accompanying destroyers carried real Exocets, but their sonar was old and limited. The Argentine plan was a pincer. 25 de Mayo would strike from the northeast with air power, while Belgrano's group pressed from the southwest, compressing Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward's carrier battle group between converging threats. Woodward feared exactly this scenario. His surface escorts weren't configured to handle a heavy surface threat from 2 axes simultaneously, and his 2 carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, were irreplaceable. As Woodward himself reflected, if the Argentines managed to get within Exocet range from multiple directions, the British could all be swimming in the South Atlantic, wondering where the missiles came from. British signals intelligence had intercepted Lombardo's orders. On the evening of May 1st, he commanded all Argentine naval units to seek out the British task force and launch a massive attack the following day. Task Group 79.3 was to head toward the British fleet at 5:30 on May 2nd. The British knew what was coming, and they had a submarine sitting directly behind the southern jaw of the pincer. On the morning of May 1st, Wreford-Brown brought Conqueror to periscope depth and caught his first visual contact with Task Group 79.3. Sethia was on the periscope. He sighted mast tops on the distant horizon, called out the bearing, and sonar confirmed the contacts matched Belgrano and her escorts. When he looked again, the hulls were visible, 4 vessels steaming abeam of each other, apparently conducting a fuel replenishment operation from the tanker YPF Puerto Rosales. It was, he later wrote, a thrilling moment. The problem was rules of engagement. Standing orders for the nuclear submarines, controlled directly from Strategic Command at Northwood under Admiral John Fieldhouse, permitted attacks outside the total exclusion zone only against the carrier 25 de Mayo. Belgrano was outside the TEZ and wasn't the carrier. Conqueror couldn't fire. So Wreford-Brown shadowed. For more than 30 hours, Conqueror tracked the Argentine group as it moved eastward toward the area south of the Falklands, relaying positions to Northwood. None of the Argentine ships was using active sonar. None was zigzagging, the basic precaution against submarine attack. Belgrano made a gentle weave at about 13 knots, but nothing aggressive enough to complicate tracking. Sethia stood watches on the periscope, watching the silhouettes of the ships inch across his eyepiece, close enough at times to make out deck structures. The crew inside Conqueror worked in the hum and heat of a nuclear submarine running submerged in hostile waters. The ever-present vibration of the reactor, the recycled air, the low-lit control room where sonar operators listened through headphones for any change in the propeller signatures ahead. The real danger, beyond the escorts, was geography. South of the Falklands lay the Birdwood Bank, an underwater plateau where the seabed rose sharply from around 10,000 feet to as little as 150 in places, poorly charted and barely mapped at depth. Nautical charts of the era prioritized surface hazards. Underwater obstacles could be miles from their plotted positions. If Belgrano crossed those shallows, Conqueror couldn't follow without risking a collision with an unmapped seamount. The towed sonar array would be destroyed by the passage through shallow water, blinding the submarine to contacts at long range. The bank was also a natural place for the Argentine group to split up. If the 3 ships separated there, Wreford-Brown might lose all of them. Woodward understood the clock. He needed to remove 1 claw of the pincer while he still could. He already had permission to attack 25 de Mayo, but the carrier had slipped past the northern submarine. HMS Splendid had briefly detected her, but lost contact in rough weather. Belgrano, on the other hand, sat right in front of Conqueror's sonar. On the morning of May 2nd, Woodward sent a signal to Conqueror authorizing an attack, an order he didn't actually have the authority to issue for a target outside the TEZ. The message was intercepted before it reached the submarine, but it forced the question up the chain of command and caught the attention of those in London who could authorize what Woodward couldn't. Admiral of the Fleet Terence Lewin, Chief of the Defence Staff, brought the request to the War Cabinet meeting at Chequers that Sunday afternoon. Margaret Thatcher, Defence Secretary John Knott, Willie Whitelaw, and the assembled members heard Lewin's assessment. The Argentines were executing a classic pincer. Belgrano's course and speed were irrelevant to the threat she posed, and there was a strong possibility that Conqueror might lose contact if a decision wasn't made now. The intelligence about Lombardo's attack order was on the table. So was the fact that British ships had sustained air attacks the previous day. Thatcher wrote later that the decision was clear. British forces should be able to attack any Argentine naval vessel on the same basis as previously agreed for the carrier. Defense Secretary Knott later called it one of the easiest decisions of the entire war. At 1:30 p.m. on May 2nd, Northwood transmitted the change in rules of engagement. Belgrano had reversed course at 8:11 that morning, heading west, not toward port, but toward a standby zone roughly 100 nautical miles east of Isla de los Estados and about 35 nautical miles south of the TEZ boundary. The Argentine pincer attack had been cancelled overnight. 25 de Mayo suffered an engine malfunction. Light winds over the Northern Ocean prevented her Skyhawks from launching fully loaded. The element of surprise had been compromised when a British aircraft detected the carrier group. At 5 o'clock on May 2nd, the order came to cancel the attack. Belgrano was loitering, waiting for new orders. She could turn east again at any point. Once the order was confirmed, Belgrano had been moving away for hours. Wreford-Brown immediately transmitted his intention to attack and ordered the crew to make up the lost ground. Over the next 2 hours, Conqueror stalked Belgrano in deteriorating conditions. Sea state 3 to 4, steadily worsening, visibility reduced through lingering mist to as little as 2,100 yards. Wreford-Brown brought the boat to periscope depth at least 5 times to get a visual track, each observation risking detection if a lookout on the Argentine ships happened to catch the slim column of the periscope cutting through the waves. He accelerated to close the gap, then ordered a dive to gain speed before surfacing again for another look. Belgrano was doing a gentle zigzag at about 13 knots. None of the Argentine ships was pinging with active sonar. At 18:13 Greenwich Mean Time, Conqueror took up a firing position on Belgrano's port beam. Wreford-Brown's log, later released by the Ministry of Defence, records the attack plan in precise tactical language. A salvo of 3 Mark VIII Mod 4 torpedoes from 1,800 yards on a torpedo track angle of 100 degrees with 0 gyro angle, then evasion to the southeast, putting the datum between the submarine and the destroyers for as long as possible. The control room went to action stations. Sethia later described the atmosphere as intense yet controlled. Each man went about his job professionally, giving and acknowledging orders, reporting tube status, confirming firing solutions. The seconds built. At the periscope, Wreford-Brown watched the cruiser's long hull fill his eyepiece. The Mark VIIIs in the tubes were unguided. Once they left the submarine, they would run in a straight line at a fixed depth until they hit something or their fuel ran out. There was no steering them after launch, no course correction, no wire to send commands down. The entire attack depended on Wreford-Brown's firing solution being right. The range, the bearing, the target's speed and heading, all calculated in the moments before he gave the order. If he was wrong by a few degrees, 3 torpedoes would vanish into empty ocean, and Belgrano would know a submarine was there. Sethia wrote that until the moment of firing, it had felt as if everything in their lives had been a dress rehearsal for a performance that would never be given. But at that moment, the rehearsal was over. There were real people on board that cruiser, and they had just fired 3 high-explosive torpedoes at her. At 15:57 Falkland Islands time, roughly 4 p.m. local, Wreford-Brown gave the order. Tubes 6, 1 and 2 fired at 3-second intervals, sending 3 unguided torpedoes into the water at a range of approximately 1,400 yards. Running time, roughly 56 seconds. Wreford-Brown stayed at the periscope. His log records what he saw. An orange fireball just aft of the centre of the target, in line with the aftermast, shortly after the first explosion was heard. A second explosion, about 5 seconds later. He thought he saw a spurt of water aft, but it may have been smoke from the first. A third explosion heard, but not seen. "I wasn't looking," he wrote. 2 of the 3 Mark VIIIs struck Belgrano on the port side. The first hit 10 to 15 meters aft of the bow, outside the area protected by the ship's side armor or internal anti-torpedo bulge. It blew off the bow section entirely, but the watertight bulkheads behind the lost section held, and the forward powder magazine for the 40mm guns didn't detonate. No crewmen were in that part of the ship at the time. The second torpedo hit 3/4 of the way along the hull, just outside the rear limit of the side armor plating. It punched through the hull and detonated in the aft machine room. The blast tore upward through 2 mess decks and a recreation area the crew called the soda fountain, where hundreds of men had congregated at watch change, before ripping a 20-meter hole in the main deck. Approximately 275 men died in and around that single explosion. The hit destroyed the ship's electrical power system. Generators failed. Belgrano lost all motive power. She couldn't run her pumps. She couldn't put out a radio distress call. Smoke filled the ship within seconds. The third torpedo missed the cruiser entirely. It struck the escort destroyer Hipólito Bouchard at the end of its run, apparently too slow to arm the warhead. Bouchard's crew felt the impact. Later examination in dry dock revealed 4 gashes in the hull consistent with a torpedo strike, but no detonation. If the Mark VIII had been travelling a few knots faster, Wreford-Brown would have hit 2 warships with a single salvo. Conqueror dove deep and ran southeast. The control room had erupted in a brief cheer at the sound of the first explosion. The crew knew they'd hit. Followed, as second-in-command Tim McClement later described it, by absolute silence, as every man thought his own thoughts. McClements were of the more than 1,000 sailors aboard Belgrano, doing exactly the same job their government had tasked them to do. They were a long way from home, in a cold sea. The submarine ran for an hour, shuddering from distant detonations, the crew carrying out evasion maneuvers against what they believed were depth charges from the escorts hunting them. Imperial War Museum's records from crew interviews reference the crew's reaction to depth charges being dropped and the evasion tactics that followed. The tension inside the hull was real. A Churchill-class boat running deep, listening on passive sonar, hearing explosions from astern. No one aboard knew whether the next sound would be closer. But aboard Bouchard, the picture was different. Captain Washington Barcena later told Sethia directly, face-to-face in Buenos Aires years afterward, that his ship never fired a weapon. The sonar was working, he said, but it was very old and not much good. What Conqueror's crew had heard was likely Belgrano's own ammunition and boilers detonating as the cruiser tore itself apart. The escorts were out of visual contact with Belgrano in the gloom and worsening weather and hadn't seen her distress rockets or lamp signals. Barcena moved his ship away from the area. He was worried the submarine would come back. By the time the destroyers realized Belgrano was gone, it was dark and the weather had turned savage. Aboard the cruiser, the situation had been beyond saving from the moment of the second hit. Nestor Cenci, the ship's supply officer and third in command, was in his bunk when the first torpedoes struck. The lights went out. He heard a muffled explosion. The ship seemed to rise out of the water as if she'd struck a sandbank. He fought his way through smoke-filled darkness toward the bridge. Before he reached it, the second torpedo tore into the hull. By the time he arrived topside, Belgrano was listing to port. Captain Hector Bonzo was trying to turn the stricken ship to face the submarine, presenting a smaller target, but the attempt was futile. Every major system was gone. Power, propulsion, pumps, communications. The ship had been sailing with watertight doors open, a failure of battle readiness that accelerated the flooding as water poured through the second torpedo's hull breach faster than it could ever have been controlled. 20 minutes after the attack, at 16:24 local time, Bonzo ordered the crew to abandon ship. The evacuation was orderly despite everything. Inflatable life rafts deployed, and men climbed in, far more than the rafts were designed for. Chenchi's raft held 33 men in a space built for 12. The body heat from that many men crammed together was what kept them alive through the night. Other rafts, carrying 4 or 5 survivors, didn't have that margin. Those men died from exposure in the darkness. The storm that had been building all day on May 2nd broke over the survivors that night. Waves of 30 feet, near freezing water temperatures in the open South Atlantic. Life rafts scattered across miles of ocean with no way to signal for help. The electrical failure had prevented Belgrano from broadcasting a distress call, and the escorts didn't know what had happened. It took 36 hours for rescue to arrive. Argentine and Chilean ships pulled 772 survivors from the water between May 3rd and May 5th. 323 men were killed, 321 crew and 2 civilians. Nearly half of all Argentine military deaths in the entire Falklands War occurred aboard a single ship in a single afternoon. Chenchi told Sethia years later about the worst moment. It wasn't the torpedo, or the night in the raft, or the cold. It was afterward, when the survivors assembled in an aircraft hangar at the naval base. They called out the names of the crew, one by one. Sometimes there was a response, often there was silence. And you knew, with great sadness, that the person was dead. In a 2003 interview, Captain Bonzo accepted the attack as a legitimate act of war. It was absolutely not a war crime, he said 2 years before his death. It was an act of war, lamentably legal. The sinking provoked immediate political controversy. Belgrano had been 36 miles outside the British-declared total exclusion zone. Critics, including Labour MP Tam Dalyell, argued the attack was illegitimate. The ship had been heading away from the islands. Documents leaked to Dalyell in 1985 by senior civil servant Clive Ponting led to a prosecution under the Official Secrets Act, which ended in acquittal. The debate reached the House of Commons and the House of Lords across multiple sessions in 1983 and 1985. The British legal position rested on a diplomatic message sent via the Swiss embassy to Buenos Aires on April 23rd, 9 days before the attack. It warned Argentina explicitly that any warship or aircraft posing a threat to British forces would be engaged regardless of its position relative to the exclusion zone. Argentine Rear Admiral Walter Alara, who commanded the wider task force, acknowledged what this meant. After that message, the entire South Atlantic was an operational theatre for both sides. Bonzo himself said the 200-mile exclusion limit ceased to apply as far as he was concerned once real combat began on May 1st. The operational reality was that Belgrano belonged to an active naval task force whose attack had been paused, not cancelled. She remained capable of reversing course at any moment. Woodward saw a warship that could be within striking range of his carriers inside 15 hours. He acted on that assessment. The 3 torpedoes that struck on the afternoon of May 2nd accomplished what diplomacy and the entire carrier battle group had not. Following the loss of Belgrano, the Argentine Navy withdrew its major surface combatants to port. 25 de Mayo never launched the Skyhawk strike. She stayed in coastal waters for the rest of the war, along with every other significant Argentine surface unit. British nuclear submarines continued to operate between Argentina and the Falklands, gathering intelligence, providing early warning of air raids, and effectively imposing sea denial. With the carrier gone from the fight, every Argentine aircraft had to fly from mainland bases at the extreme limit of their range, more than 400 nautical miles, with minutes of loitering time over targets, rather than the sustained operations a carrier air wing could provide. The minimal role of the Navy in the remainder of the campaign cost the service its credibility and influence within the ruling military junta. The British now had effective sea control around the Falklands. Without surface vessels, Argentina couldn't resupply its garrison by sea, forcing all logistics through a shrinking air bridge. US Ambassador Harry Schlauderman, observing from the region, offered a blunt assessment. The sinking virtually ended the war, because with the Argentine Navy out of the conflict, supplying the troops was impossible. The British amphibious landings at San Carlos went ahead on May 21st, 3 weeks later. Conqueror's war didn't end with the Belgrano. On May 3rd, Wreford-Brown received orders to seek out and sink the surviving escorts, though not to engage ships conducting rescue operations. Over the following days, he encountered several vessels, determined they were searching for survivors, and held fire. On May 7th, an Argentine C-130 Hercules reportedly passed 100 feet overhead at midday and spotted the submarine's wake and raised periscope. The Argentine Air Force may have attacked the submarine with air-launched torpedoes in the days that followed, though the details remain uncertain. Wreford-Brown's log, covering the weeks after the sinking, reveals a submarine increasingly struggling with the toll of prolonged operations in hostile waters. He recorded a series of technical and mechanical problems that frustrated his efforts to pursue additional Argentine warships. An overheating nuclear reactor required attention. On May 21st, the day of the San Carlos landings, a faulty high-frequency trailing wire antenna forced HMS Valiant to deploy in Conqueror's place, sidelining the boat that had delivered the most consequential blow of the campaign. "I now sit with another submarine between me and any chance of some action," Wreford-Brown wrote in his log. These problems accumulated after the attack, not before it. The distinction matters. Conqueror wasn't a wreck when she fired on the Belgrano. She was a submarine carrying the wear of weeks of hard service in ferocious seas, with one weapon system she couldn't trust. The faults were real, but they were the kind of faults that every submarine patrol produces. The gap between the pristine vessel in the dockyard and the battered one that actually goes to war. HMS Conqueror returned to Faslane on July 4, 1982, flying the Jolly Roger, the Royal Navy submarine tradition marking a confirmed kill. The flag bore an atom symbol for the only nuclear submarine with a wartime sinking, crossed torpedoes for the weapon type, a dagger for a classified operation, and the silhouette of a cruiser. That flag is now displayed at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport, alongside the submarine's periscopes, captain's cabin, and control room panels. When asked later about the attack, Wreford-Brown offered a line that became famous in the submarine service. "The Royal Navy spent 13 years preparing me for such an occasion. It would have been regarded as extremely dreary if I had fouled it up." What he'd done was track an enemy task group for days in worsening weather, reject the modern torpedo his Navy had spent 2 decades developing because he judged, correctly, that it couldn't be trusted, close to 1,400 yards of an armed cruiser escorted by missile-carrying destroyers, and fire 3 unguided weapons on a straight bearing. 2 hit. Argentina's major surface combatants never ventured out again. The amphibious landings proceeded. The war turned decisively. One of the most consequential naval actions since 1945 was delivered by a submarine whose newest torpedo didn't work reliably, and whose commander chose a weapon designed in 1927 over the one his navy had spent 20 years and millions of pounds developing. Wreford-Brown didn't wait for a better tool. He used the one he had. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe for more like it.